Before the first hints of dawn filter through the narrow streets, imagine stirring awake in a cramped upper room of an insula, the thin walls carrying every distant sound from below. As a Roman mother or father, you rise in that half-light, the air still carrying the night's chill mixed with the lingering smoke of yesterday's cooking fire and the sharper tang of bread already baking in nearby shops. Children's small forms shift on their shared pallets, and outside the clatter of carts begins, vendors calling out their morning offerings while the Tiber's damp breath drifts upward, blending with the earthy scent of wet stone and early market goods. The city feels alive yet unhurried at this hour, its rhythms older than any single lifetime, the same pulse that once guided countless families through these same alleys and stairwells. What did it truly mean to raise children here, amid the constant hum of empire and everyday survival, where every choice carried echoes of both opportunity and uncertainty? We can only piece together fragments from letters, inscriptions and household remains, each hinting at lives shaped by affection, duty, and the quiet resilience needed to keep a household steady. As these ancient patterns unfold in your mind, I wonder where you are listening from right now, perhaps in the quiet hours before your own day begins. If it feels right, share in the comments what time it is and the place you're hearing this from. Across the globe and the centuries, such connections remind us how universal these small daily moments remain. Before the first hints of dawn filter through the narrow streets, imagine stirring awake in a cramped upper room of an insula, the thin walls carrying every distant sound from below. As a Roman mother or father, you rise in that half-light, the air still carrying the night's chill mixed with the lingering smoke of yesterday's cooking fire and the sharper tang of bread already baking in nearby shops. Children's small forms shift on their shared pallets, and outside the clatter of carts begins, vendors calling out their morning offerings while the Tiber's damp breath drifts upward, blending with the earthy scent of wet stone and early market goods. The city feels alive yet unhurried at this hour, its rhythms older than any single lifetime, the same pulse that once guided countless families through these same alleys and stairwells. What did it truly mean to raise children here, amid the constant hum of empire and everyday survival, where every choice carried echoes of both opportunity and uncertainty? We can only piece together fragments from letters, inscriptions and household remains, each hinting at lives shaped by affection, duty, and the quiet resilience needed to keep a household steady. As these ancient patterns unfold in your mind, I wonder where you're listening from right now, perhaps in the quiet hours before your own day begins. If it feels right, share in the comments what time it is and the place you're hearing this from. Across the globe and the centuries, such connections remind us how universal these small daily moments remain. Yet for those expecting a child, the quiet hours carried an added weight of anticipation and unspoken fears. Ordinary women in Rome might first notice the absence of their monthly courses, or perhaps a subtle shift in appetite that left them craving certain foods while turning from others, signs interpreted not through medical charts, but through the wisdom passed down from mothers and neighbours. Some believed the moon's phases influenced the growing life within, while others turned to simple tests like observing how barley or wheat responded when steeped in urine, practices that offered a fragile sense of knowing amid the uncertainties of the body. Practical realities pressed close for plebeian families living in multi-storey buildings. Work in markets or workshops continued as long as strength allowed, with no formal leave and the support of extended kin or fellow tenants, often determined whether a pregnancy felt manageable or overwhelming. Herbs like pennyroyal or rue might be sought quietly for easing discomfort, though their use walked a narrow line between remedy and risk, reflecting the blend of folk knowledge and caution that shaped everyday hopes. When the time for birth drew near, the household transformed into a space of hushed preparation. Midwives, experienced women drawn from the neighbourhood rather than distant physicians, guided the process with hands skilled in massage and positioning, drawing on traditions that emphasized the mother's comfort through warm compresses and supportive postures. Family rituals unfolded quietly too, perhaps an offering of incense to Juno Lucina, the goddess who eased the path of new life, or whispered prayers at a small household shrine to invite protection during the hours of labour. Yet the odds remained stark and ever-present. Complications from infection, hemorrhage, or difficult deliveries claimed many mothers and infants alike, with survival rates that varied by access to even basic care and the unpredictable strength of each woman's constitution. In these moments, the line between joy and loss felt thin, as neighbours might gather outside to lend their presence without intruding, their murmurs carrying both encouragement and the shared memory of births that had ended in sorrow. Once the child emerged, the decisive moment rested with the paterfamilias, the father whose legal authority extended even to this fragile beginning. He would examine the newborn, assessing its vigour and wholeness in a custom rooted in the practical demands of household survival, where resources stretched thin across generations. If the infant appeared too weak, or the family circumstances too strained, the possibility of exposure lingered as a sombre option, a practice not taken lightly but acknowledged in legal texts and occasional inscriptions as part of the harsh calculus of urban life. For most, however, acceptance meant the child entered the fold, wrapped carefully and placed at the father's feet in a gesture that symbolized belonging. This choice, made in the dim light of the home, carried the weight of future obligations and affections, shaping not just one life, but the delicate balance of the entire family unit amid Rome's crowded insulae and bustling forums. In the delicate first days that followed, naming ceremonies marked the infant's formal entry into the world. For girls, this often occurred on the 8th day, and for boys on the 9th, a timing some linked to lunar cycles, or simply the need to confirm the child's stability after the perils of birth. During the lustratio ritual, the family gathered for a purification with water and offerings, bestowing a name that tied the child to ancestral lines, while acknowledging the vulnerabilities still ahead. These early hours remained fraught with quiet vigilance, as fevers or feeding difficulties could arise without warning, and parents leaned on amulets or small charms hung near the cradle to ward off unseen threats. Through it all, the rhythm of the city continued outside, the calls of vendors, the shuffle of feet on stairs, reminding everyone that new life arrived not in isolation, but woven into the enduring fabric of Roman existence, where each addition brought fresh threads of hope and continuity. As these early bonds formed, one senses the pull toward the years ahead, when that infant would begin navigating the streets and lessons of Rome itself. As the first weeks unfolded in the shadowed corners of the Insula, that newborn, now named and purified, entered a world of careful hands and quiet vigilance, where swaddling cloths bound the tiny limbs straight against the body, in the belief that such wrapping encouraged strong bones and calm spirits. Mothers often performed this task themselves at dawn or dusk, folding the linen strips with practiced fingers, while slaves, if the household could afford even one, stood ready with warmed oils or extra wrappings to ease the process in the chill of the upper room. Lullabies drifted through those moments, simple melodies passed from grandmother to daughter, their words invoking gentle gods, or the steady flow of the Tiber to coax sleep amid the constant street noises below. These songs carried no grand verses, just repeated phrases about safe harbours and full bellies, their rhythms matching the slow rock of a cradle fashioned from wood or wicker, a small island of comfort in a city that never truly stilled. For many ordinary families, the daily care fell to the mother whenever strength returned after birth, yet the demands of market work or workshop labour often meant shared duties with older siblings, or a hired wet nurse drawn from the neighbourhood. Wet nurses appeared most often when a mother's milk failed or when another pregnancy followed too quickly, a practical choice rooted in survival rather than detachment. In wealthier plebeian homes, such arrangements could stretch for 2 or 3 years, freeing the mother for household tasks while the nurse provided the steady nourishment that bound her own child to the family through shared milk. Yet this practice stirred quiet questions about the threads of affection. Did the infant form its first loyalties to the nurse's voice and scent, or did the mother's evening returns and whispered stories still anchor the bond? Inscriptions and letters hint at both tenderness and tension, with some parents viewing the nurse as an extension of their care and others fearing the divided heart it might create, especially when the child later showed preference for the woman who fed it through long nights. Death hovered close in those early months, its presence woven into every feeding and every sleep. Infant mortality claimed perhaps 1 in 3 children before their first birthday, though exact numbers shift with each city's records and each family's access to clean water or basic remedies. A sudden fever or weak cry could end the brief life without warning, leaving parents to navigate grief through small rituals, placing a lock of hair or a toy beside the tiny body before burial outside the city walls. Coping came not through denial, but through the steady acceptance that many births ended this way, expressed in tomb markers that sometimes captured a parent's raw ache, a father noting the child's brief smile, a mother offering a final prayer to the household gods. These losses did not harden hearts entirely, for the same families often welcomed another child soon after, their resilience shaped by the understanding that survival itself was a fragile gift amid Rome's crowded tenements and variable seasons. When the first teeth emerged and the swaddling loosened, attention turned to the tentative milestones that marked a toddler's place in the household. Weaning began gradually around the second year, with soft foods like barley porridge thinned with honey or goat's milk, or mashed figs and bread soaked in olive oil. Simple offerings tested first on a parent's finger to ensure no choking. Slaves or older siblings might hold the child upright during these meals, encouraging small sips and bites while the mother returned from errands, her lap becoming the favoured spot for those first unsteady tastes. Crawling and then walking followed in their own time, often celebrated with modest offerings at the household shrine rather than grand feasts, as parents watched the child pull itself along furniture edges or toddle across the packed earth floor. These steps brought both delight and new worries, for a toddler's curiosity could lead to falls down narrow stairs, or encounters with open cooking fires, prompting extra amulets and constant eyes from the family circle. Through it all, the rhythms of care blended affection with necessity, the same lullabies now sung to soothe a teething child or distract from a scraped knee. Regular parents balanced these duties against the city's demands, yet the small victories, a first word shaped like mama, a steady gait across the room, wove deeper ties that carried forward into the years of play and learning ahead. One senses how these tender beginnings, fragile as they were, rooted the enduring sense of family that defined Roman life long after the swaddling cloths were set aside. As the child grew beyond those first unsteady steps and tentative words, the household's rhythms began to shape them in ways both gentle and unyielding, drawing them outward from the cradle's quiet circle into the wider pulse of Roman life. In ordinary plebeian families, this shift unfolded without ceremony, yet parents watched closely for signs of character that might guide the path ahead. Boys and girls often absorbed their earliest lessons side by side in the cramped insular rooms or the shaded doorways overlooking the street, but expectations soon diverged like branches from the same sturdy trunk. A son might sense the weight of future responsibilities through his father's quiet nods toward the workshop bench or the market stall, where strength and quick wit promised a place in the city's endless cycle of trade and labour. Daughters, by contrast, absorbed the intricate dance of household management from their mothers, learning to stretch meagre resources across meals, to mend garments with careful stitches, and to navigate the subtle alliances that kept neighbours and kin bound together. These patterns were never rigid, of course. In some homes a girl might linger at the edge of her brother's lessons in basic reckoning or bargaining, her curiosity quietly encouraged when extra hands were needed, while a boy might linger longer in the kitchen learning to coax flavour from simple grains, especially if the family trade leaned toward food vending rather than heavy craft. Such learning happened most often through doing rather than deliberate instruction, as children folded themselves into the daily tasks that sustained the family. A boy of 7 or 8 might already stand beside his father at the potter's wheel or the leatherworker's bench, his small hands guided through the motions of shaping clay or punching holes until repetition turned awkward effort into something approaching skill. Girls helped sort lentils or grind herbs for remedies, their fingers growing deft at tasks that would one day define their own hearths. This apprenticeship of presence carried its own quiet lessons in social roles, teaching deference to elders, the value of shared labour, and the unspoken rules of status that separated citizen families from freed slaves or foreigners in the same tenement. One imagines the conversations that accompanied these moments, stories of distant relatives who had risen through diligence or warnings about the dangers of idleness, passed down like heirlooms while hands stayed busy, yet the boundaries remained porous, allowing room for a child's particular temperament to bend the pattern. A quick-fingered daughter might assist with accounts in a small shop, while a thoughtful son might take on more domestic duties if an older sister married early. Amid these duties, the streets of Rome offered a different kind of education, one of chaotic freedom that parents both permitted and fretted over. Children spilled from doorways into the narrow lanes at dawn, their laughter mingling with the calls of vendors and the creak of cartwheels, turning the city's public spaces into an improvised playground. Simple toys fashioned from scraps, wooden dolls with jointed limbs, clay animals baked in household ovens, or knuckle bones polished smooth from repeated games, filled pockets and hands, while group games like tag or mock battles with sticks echoed the larger spectacles of the arena without ever leaving the neighbourhood. Girls might join circles for games of chance with coloured stones or practice dances learned at festivals, their play blending into the work of fetching water or minding younger siblings. Boys often ranged farther, climbing walls or racing along the Tiber's edge when chores allowed, their explorations tempered by the ever-present risk of traffic, stray dogs, or the occasional scuffle with children from rival blocks. This street life fostered resilience and quick thinking, qualities prized in a city where survival depended on reading the moods of crowds and authorities alike. Yet it also exposed young ones to the raw edges of Roman existence. The sight of debtors led away, the sounds of arguments spilling from taverns, the constant reminder that fortune could shift with a single harvest or illness. To shield against such uncertainties, parents turned to tangible protections that blended practical caution with spiritual reassurance. The bulla, a small locket often crafted from gold or leather and filled with charms or amulets, hung around a freeborn boy's neck from the day of his naming until the moment he exchanged it for the toga of manhood, its presence meant to ward off evil spirits and mark his protected status within the household. Girls wore simpler versions or strings of beads blessed at household shrines, sometimes incorporating herbs or inscribed tokens invoking Juno or other guardians of youth. These objects were not mere ornaments, they carried the weight of parental hope, renewed during festivals with fresh offerings of incense or small cakes left at the family altar. Beyond the bulla, everyday safeguards included whispered prayers at thresholds, the careful selection of playmates from trusted neighbours, and the constant presence of older siblings acting as informal guardians during those street adventures. Inscriptions from later centuries suggest that such measures brought comfort, even when they could not guarantee safety, reflecting a worldview where divine favour and human vigilance worked together against the city's hazards. Through these layered experiences, the growing child came to embody the family's quiet aspirations, carrying forward the same blend of affection and necessity that had marked the toddler years. The streets and workshops became classrooms without walls, where lessons in resilience emerged alongside the games and the charms, preparing young Romans not just for labour, but for the enduring ties of kinship that would sustain them into adulthood. One senses how these formative seasons, marked by both freedom and restraint, deepened the sense of belonging that would later anchor them amid Rome's larger demands. As the child grew beyond those first unsteady steps and tentative words, the household's rhythms began to shape them in ways both gentle and unyielding, drawing them outward from the cradle's quiet circle into the wider pulse of Roman life. In ordinary plebeian families, this shift unfolded without ceremony, yet parents watched closely for signs of character that might guide the path ahead. Boys and girls often absorbed their earliest lessons side by side, in the cramped insular rooms or the shaded doorways overlooking the street, but expectations soon diverged like branches from the same sturdy trunk. A son might sense the weight of future responsibilities through his father's quiet nods toward the workshop bench or the market stall where strength and quick wit promised a place in the city's endless cycle of trade and labour. Daughters, by contrast, absorbed the intricate dance of household management from their mothers, learning to stretch meagre resources across meals, to mend garments with careful stitches, and to navigate the subtle alliances that kept neighbours and kin bound together. These patterns were never rigid, of course. In some homes, a girl might linger at the edge of her brother's lessons in basic reckoning or bargaining, her curiosity quietly encouraged when extra hands were needed, while a boy might linger longer in the kitchen learning to coax flavour from simple grains, especially if the family trade leaned toward food vending rather than heavy craft. Such learning happened most often through doing rather than deliberate instruction, as children folded themselves into the daily tasks that sustained the family. A boy of 7 or 8 might already stand beside his father at the potter's wheel or the leather-worker's bench, his small hands guided through the motions of shaping clay or punching holes until repetition turned awkward effort into something approaching skill. Girls helped sort lentils or grind herbs for remedies, their fingers growing deft at tasks that would one day define their own hearths. This apprenticeship of presence carried its own quiet lessons in social roles, teaching deference to elders, the value of shared labour, and the unspoken rules of status that separated citizen families from freed slaves or foreigners in the same tenement. One imagines the conversations that accompanied these moments, stories of distant relatives who had risen through diligence or warnings about the dangers of idleness, passed down like heirlooms while hands stayed busy. Yet the boundaries remained porous, allowing room for a child's particular temperament to bend the pattern. A quick-fingered daughter might assist with accounts in a small shop, while a thoughtful son might take on more domestic duties if an older sister married early. Amid these duties, the streets of Rome offered a different kind of education, one of chaotic freedom that parents both permitted and fretted over. Children spilled from doorways into the narrow lanes at dawn, their laughter mingling with the calls of vendors and the creak of cart wheels, turning the city's public spaces into an improvised playground. Simple toys fashioned from scraps, wooden dolls with jointed limbs, clay animals baked in household ovens, or knuckle bones polished smooth from repeated games, filled pockets and hands, while group games like tag or mock battles with sticks echoed the larger spectacles of the arena without ever leaving the neighbourhood. Girls might join circles for games of chance with coloured stones, or practice dances learned at festivals, their play blending into the work of fetching water or minding younger siblings. Boys often range farther, climbing walls or racing along the Tiber's edge when chores allowed, their explorations tempered by the ever-present risk of traffic, stray dogs, or the occasional scuffle with children from rival blocks. This street life fostered resilience and quick thinking, qualities prized in a city where survival depended on reading the moods of crowds and authorities alike. Yet it also exposed young ones to the raw edges of Roman existence. The sight of debtors led away, the sounds of arguments spilling from taverns, the constant reminder that fortune could shift with a single harvest or illness. To shield against such uncertainties, parents turned to tangible protections that blended practical caution with spiritual reassurance. The bulla, a small locket often crafted from gold or leather and filled with charms or amulets, hung around a freeborn boy's neck from the day of his naming until the moment he exchanged it for the toga of manhood, its presence meant to ward off evil spirits and mark his protected status within the household. Girls wore simpler versions or strings of beads blessed at household shrines, sometimes incorporating herbs or inscribed tokens invoking Juno or other guardians of youth. These objects were not mere ornaments, they carried the weight of parental hope, renewed during festivals with fresh offerings of incense or small cakes left at the family altar. Beyond the bulla, everyday safeguards included whispered prayers at thresholds, the careful selection of playmates from trusted neighbours, and the constant presence of older siblings acting as informal guardians during those street adventures. Inscriptions from later centuries suggest that such measures brought comfort even when they could not guarantee safety, reflecting a worldview where divine favour and human vigilance worked together against the city's hazards. Through these layered experiences, the growing child came to embody the family's quiet aspirations, carrying forward the same blend of affection and necessity that had marked the toddler years. The streets and workshops became classrooms without walls, where lessons in resilience emerged alongside the games and the charms, preparing young Romans not just for labour, but for the enduring ties of kinship that would sustain them into adulthood. One senses how these formative seasons, marked by both freedom and restraint, deepened the sense of belonging that would later anchor them amid Rome's larger demands. Yet for a small number of ordinary families, another door might open briefly, one that promised letters and numbers rather than the immediate grip of tools or the rhythm of market calls. Formal schooling remained rare among plebeian households, a privilege glimpsed more often in whispers than in daily practice, reserved perhaps for those with a modest surplus or a neighbourly connection to a freed teacher seeking pupils. One pictures a handful of children, maybe 5 or 6, gathering in the corner of a rented room or beneath the awning of a taberna at dawn, their tunics still dusty from the night's sleep, while a grammarian or literator, often a former slave himself, sat on a low stool and guided them through the alphabet scratched on wax tablets. The ludus literarius offered little in the way of comfort or spectacle. Lessons unfolded in the open air or cramped quarters where the smell of ink mingled with street dust, and the only furnishings might be a few benches or a portable abacus passed from hand to hand. Children learned to form letters on wax with a stylus, to recite the names of numbers, and to master simple sums that could help in weighing produce or tallying coins at a stall. Reading came through repeated chanting of fables or moral sayings, their voices rising and falling in unison as the teacher corrected missteps with a firm word or at times the sting of a rod. Arithmetic focused on practical reckoning, how many denarii for a sack of grain, how to divide a day's wages, rather than abstract theory, reflecting the immediate needs of families who might one day send a son to assist in accounts. Girls attended less frequently, though some evidence hints at sisters joining brothers when space allowed, their lessons perhaps tailored toward household ledgers or the keeping of festival dates. Yet even these modest gains came at a price that most parents weighed carefully against the demands of survival. Fees, though small, still meant coins set aside from the sale of pottery shards or woven baskets, and the hours spent at the ludus meant fewer hands available for errands or chores back home. For the vast majority of ordinary children, such schooling remained an occasional dream rather than a steady path. Instead, apprenticeships wove them deeper into the family's trade from an early age, turning the workshop or marketplace into their true classroom. A boy might follow his father into the fuller's shop or the baker's oven, learning the precise temperature of the kiln or the secrets of stretching dough just so, his small frame growing accustomed to the heat and the early mornings long before he could claim a full wage. Girls often stepped into their mother's roles at the loom or the vegetable stand, mastering the art of haggling without losing a customer's goodwill or preserving the last scraps of fabric for mending. These arrangements carried no formal contracts in most plebeian cases, relying instead on the steady observation of gestures passed across generations, the quiet correction when a seam puckered or a measurement fell short. One can imagine the pride that flickered in a parent's eyes when a child first completed a task unaided, a simple sandal repaired, a batch of olives sorted without bruising, marking not just skill but the continuation of the household's fragile security. Such learning demanded patience on both sides, for mistakes meant wasted materials that a family could ill afford, yet it also built a resilience born of shared purpose, where the day's labour ended with stories told over a shared bowl of porridge. The cost of even basic education loomed large in these calculations, tipping the balance for most toward immediate work rather than distant promise. A teacher might ask for a few asses each month, enough to buy bread for several days, and the loss of a child's helping hands during harvest or festival seasons could strain already thin resources. Parents might weigh the possibility that letters could open doors to a scribe's position, or a clerk's role in a larger household, yet the uncertainty of such advancement often yielded to the certainty of food on the table tonight. In some cases, a particularly bright child might receive sporadic tutoring from a literate relative or neighbour. Their lessons squeezed between chores, but widespread access stayed elusive until later centuries brought more public initiatives. This choice reflected not indifference, but a deep pragmatism, where the family's survival intertwined with the child's future in ways that formal schooling could not always guarantee. One senses the quiet conversations at evening meals, parents pondering whether a few coins might buy a brighter horizon, or whether the loom and the stall already held the truest inheritance they could offer. These paths, whether through the ludus or the workshop, ultimately fed back into the rhythms that kept the household whole, preparing the next generation to shoulder the same burdens with whatever wisdom experience had granted. Yet the same hands that shaped clay or tallied small sums at dawn turned, without pause, to the more insistent labour of keeping hunger at bay. In the crowded Insulae where most Roman families lived, the day's first decisions often belonged to the mother, who slipped out while the street still held the cool of night. She moved through the forum or the neighbourhood stalls, weighing each purchase against coins earned the evening before, choosing the freshest greens that would not wilt before supper, and the cheapest cut of pork or fish that could stretch across 2 meals. Nothing was taken for granted. A bruised fig might be rejected, a slightly higher price for olive oil weighed against the risk of rancid flavour later in the week. Back at home she sorted what she had brought, setting aside a portion for immediate use, and tucking the rest into clay jars or woven baskets where it would remain safe from mice and the damp air of the tenement. In this quiet sorting lay the real art of Roman motherhood, the daily calculation of how far a handful of lentils or a single loaf might reach when unexpected visitors arrived or when a child's appetite grew with a growth spurt. Fathers, meanwhile, pursued the trades that supplied those coins or goods in the first place. Some hauled bricks or timber from the Tiber docks, their backs bent under loads that left calluses and aching joints by midday. Others shaped metal at the forge, mended sandals in dim workshops, or carried messages between wealthier households, each occupation promising only the barest margin above subsistence. A potter might return with a few cracked vessels he could sell, cheaply rather than discard, while a leather worker brought home scraps too small for fine work yet perfect for patching children's tunics. These labours rarely offered security. A single storm could empty the docks, a sudden illness could silence the hammer, yet the rhythm of work and return shaped the household's sense of time. Children already familiar with the workshop bench now watched for the father's footsteps, knowing that whatever he carried would determine whether the evening meal included meat or simply the familiar pulse of porridge thickened with yesterday's bread. For many ordinary families that margin grew thinner still without the monthly grain dole. The state's distribution of free or subsidised grain to registered citizens formed a quiet backbone of survival, a recognition that the city's vast population could not feed itself through private wages alone. Families lined up at the appointed stations, tokens in hand, to receive their allotment of unmilled wheat, which then had to be ground at home or taken to a local miller who kept a portion as payment. Without this steady supply, the price of bread could spike after poor harvests or disrupted shipping routes, turning an ordinary month into a scramble for alternatives like chestnuts or barley. Yet the dole itself carried its own uncertainties. Registration required proof of citizenship, and names could be struck from the list during political shifts, leaving households to improvise with whatever vegetables or preserved fish they could afford. Parents spoke of these allotments not as charity but as a fragile right, one that eased the constant worry yet never removed it entirely. Inside the home, the kitchen, often little more than a corner with a brazier or a shared oven down the street, became the stage where all these efforts met. Cooking followed the sun rather than the clock. Morning might bring a simple gruel of grain and water, stirred while the children ate, while midday offered whatever remained from the previous night reheated with a few herbs. Evening demanded more care. Vegetables cleaned and chopped, pulses soaked since dawn now simmered with salt or a precious splash of oil, and any meat available cut into small pieces so its flavour could season the entire pot. Preservation techniques extended what little abundance existed. Fruits were dried on rooftops during summer heat, fish packed in salt or brine, olives pressed into oil that would last through winter. A mother might teach her daughter the precise moment to pull bread from the communal oven before it scorched, or how to seal a jar of honeyed figs with wax so no air could spoil the sweetness. These rhythms carried their own quiet knowledge, passed through gesture and taste rather than written recipes, and they bound the family together around the simple act of turning raw grain and garden scraps into something that sustained them until the next market day. Children already accustomed to workshop or street now slipped naturally into these tasks as well. A daughter might stand on a stool to stir the pot while her mother negotiated with a neighbour over a shared bunch of greens, learning the same careful stretching of resources that had defined her own childhood. A son home from errands could carry water from the fountain, or watch the brazier so the flame never died completely. In this way, the labour of feeding the family became another apprenticeship, one that taught patience with scarcity and ingenuity with what little remained. One senses how these daily negotiations, repeated across thousands of hearths, wove a deeper thread of continuity between generations, preparing young Romans not only to endure, but to find small moments of satisfaction in a well-seasoned bowl or a loaf that rose just right despite the limitations of the shared oven. The city's larger systems of trade and state support might shift with emperors or wars, yet the intimate work of turning grain into bread and scraps into stew remained the steady pulse that kept ordinary households alive and connected. Yet when the evening meal had been cleared and the last of the grain set aside for the morning, the same hands that had measured and portioned might find themselves reaching instead for a damp cloth or a bundle of dried herbs, because illness moved through those crowded rooms as surely as the smoke from the brazier. Children who had chased each other between market stalls or carried water without complaint one day could awaken the next, flushed and listless, their small bodies hot to the touch, and parents learned early that the boundary between a healthy appetite and sudden weakness was thin indeed. Home remedies came first, drawn from whatever the garden or the apothecary stall could supply, infusions of willow bark or fennel to ease fever, poultices of crushed mustard or cabbage leaves pressed against swollen joints, honey mixed with vinegar for a throat that rasped with every breath. These treatments passed from mother to daughter in quiet gestures, a pinch of this leaf gathered at dawn, a measured sip of that decoction taken before sleep, and they offered the first fragile line of defence when the city's narrow streets carried coughs and fevers from one insula to the next. If the fever lingered or a rash spread, the household might send for a physician, though such men varied widely in skill and came at a cost that strained already slender resources. Some practiced with careful observation, noting how a child's breathing changed, or how a wound responded to cleansing with wine. Yet even the most attentive could do little against the deeper limits of Roman medicine, where the causes of disease remained hidden behind theories of unbalanced humours or invisible airs. Surgery for abscesses or broken bones might succeed when infection stayed at bay, but many ailments simply ran their course, leaving parents to watch and wait through long nights, wondering whether the next dawn would bring relief or a heavier silence. In those hours, the ordinary calculations of the day, how far the bread would stretch, or whether the oil would last, gave way to a different kind of reckoning, one that measured hope against the steady rhythm of a child's laboured breathing. It was natural, then, that the same parents turned also to prayer and ritual, seeking protection that practical measures could not guarantee. Small offerings appeared at household shrines even on ordinary evenings, a few grains of incense scattered into the flame, a cup of watered wine poured out with murmured words, gestures performed not in grand temples but in the corner of a rented room where the family's daily life unfolded. These acts carried the quiet conviction that unseen forces watched over the threshold, and parents spoke of them as one more thread in the fabric of care, no less necessary than the careful storing of lentils or the mending of a torn tunic. When a child's illness deepened, the prayers grew more urgent, addressed to whatever deity seemed most attentive that night, yet always returning to the familiar household gods whose presence was felt in the very walls of the home. The lares and penates stood at the centre of that domestic devotion, their small painted figures or simple clay images kept in a niche near the hearth or above the doorway. The lares, guardians of the family's comings and goings, received regular tokens of respect, a garland of flowers on festival days, or a portion of the evening meal set aside before anyone else ate, while the penates watched over the pantry stores, ensuring that the grain and oil remained safe from spoilage and theft. In ordinary homes these gods were tended by whoever happened to be near. A father returning from the docks might pause to light a lamp before their images. A mother might speak their names while sweeping the floor, small acts that wove divine watchfulness into the same movements that kept the household fed and clean. Children learned these gestures early, standing on tiptoe to place a crumb of bread or a drop of oil at the shrine, absorbing without instruction the sense that the family's safety depended on both careful hands and attentive spirits. Superstitions and amulets completed this blend of practical and spiritual care, objects carried or hung where illness might enter. A bronze charm shaped like a fist or an eye could be pinned to a child's tunic, its presence meant to turn aside the evil gaze that parents feared as much as any fever, while strings of beads or inscribed tablets tucked beneath a pillow offered another layer of imagined protection. These tokens sat alongside the herbal remedies and the cooling cloths, neither replacing the other but existing together in the same anxious vigil. One can picture a mother checking both the temperature of her child's forehead and the placement of an amulet in the same motion, the two actions part of a single unbroken effort to hold sickness at bay. Such customs varied from neighbourhood to neighbourhood and from one generation to the next, yet they shared the underlying recognition that human skill alone could not secure the fragile lives gathered under one roof. Through these layered responses, illness became another rhythm in the family's life, no less shaping than the gathering of food or the tending of the fire. When recovery came, the relief expressed itself in an extra offering at the household shrine, a small vow fulfilled with gratitude, and when it did not, the same shrine received the quiet acceptance that some things lay beyond even the most careful tending. In this way, the daily worship of the lares and penates, the murmured prayers, and the amulets worn against the skin all reinforced the deeper truth that ordinary Roman parents lived with uncertainty as a constant companion, yet continued to rise each morning and measure out the grain, light the lamp, and speak the names of their household gods, trusting that continuity itself might prove stronger than any single threat. As the seasons turned and the household gods received their daily due, the year itself unfolded in a cycle of festivals that drew the family out of their narrow rooms and into the wider life of the city, offering moments when ordinary cares gave way to shared anticipation and a sense that the unseen powers might briefly align with human hopes. Children felt this rhythm first in the small signals that marked a holy day approaching, perhaps an extra measure of oil set aside or the quiet bustle of neighbours preparing garlands, and their eyes widened at the thought of processions winding through the streets, or the smell of roasted meats carried on the wind from public altars. Saturnalia brought the longest nights alive with lamps burning later than usual, masters and servants exchanging places in a brief inversion that let even the youngest sense how fragile the usual order could be, while the laughter and dice games around the hearth made the layers seem closer. Their small figures wreathed in fresh flowers as the family poured out an extra cup in thanks for the year's survival. Lupercalia stirred a different excitement, with its wild runs through the city and the touch of the runners' thongs promising fertility and protection, and parents might hold a child close to watch from a doorway, whispering that these ancient rites had kept the city's children safe long before any emperor's laws. Through a child's eyes such days carried a double meaning, at once a break from the endless fetching of water and grinding of grain, and a living reminder that the family's small world belonged to something larger, a chain of observances stretching back through generations who had marked the same turning points with the same mingled awe and relief. These public celebrations flowed naturally into private family rituals that marked the quieter thresholds of life. None more charged than the moment a boy approached manhood and prepared for the toga virilis ceremony that would declare him ready to stand among citizens. Parents watched with a mixture of pride and quiet apprehension as the youth's first beard was ritually shaved and the plain white toga of childhood set aside for the heavier garment of an adult. The simple act performed often at the household shrine where the Lares had watched over his early years. The ceremony itself might unfold with a short walk to the temple of the family's chosen deity, a sacrifice of a few coins or a libation poured by the father's hand, yet its weight lay less in spectacle than in the unspoken shift it signalled. The boy now expected to shoulder responsibilities that had once fallen to his parents alone. For many ordinary families, this transition arrived around the 14th or 15th year, when the young man might already know a trade or stand ready to accompany his father to the forum, and the mother who had once tied his childhood cloak now stepped back with a last adjustment to the new folds, aware that the same hands that had soothed fevers would soon guide him toward decisions of his own. Girls experienced their own quieter passage, often earlier, as arrangements for marriage began to shape conversations around the evening meal. Yet the same household gods witnessed both, receiving an extra offering on the day the family acknowledged that childhood had ended and the next generation's duties had begun. Marriage arrangements carried their own blend of hope and calculation, parents weighing alliances that might strengthen a modest household, while still listening for signs that their child felt some measure of affection for the chosen partner. A daughter might be promised at 16 or 17, the dowry assembled from saved coins and a few pieces of linen, and the parents who had guided her through toddler illnesses and early lessons now watched her cross the threshold into another home, the procession of torches and the scattering of nuts marking both joy and a subtle loss. Sons faced similar departures when they brought a bride into the family or established their own modest quarters nearby, and the evenings afterward felt altered, the hearth quieter without the familiar voices yet still tended with the same small gestures toward the Lares. Parents spoke little of the ache in those first weeks, instead turning their attention to grandchildren who might soon appear, carrying forward the same names and the same whispered prayers, yet the empty space at the table reminded them that the cycle of care now flowed outward as well as inward. These moments tested the quiet strength that had sustained the household through illness and scarcity, revealing how the bonds formed in narrow rooms could stretch without breaking, even as children stepped into lives of their own. As the years lengthened and the parents themselves grew older, the same family rhythms reversed direction, with adult children now measuring out grain for aging hands and adjusting the placement of amulets when joints ached more than they once had. Roman custom placed deep value on pietas, the duty that bound children to honour and support their elders, so that a widowed mother or a father whose strength had faded might continue to live within the household. Their counsel still sought on matters of trade or the proper day for planting. Care for the elderly unfolded in the same unremarkable gestures that had once sustained the young, a son now fetching water while his father rested, a daughter preparing infusions of the same herbs that had eased childhood fevers, the roles exchanged yet the underlying patience unchanged. In homes where resources remained slender, this arrangement often meant shared sleeping spaces and careful division of the evening meal, yet it also preserved the continuity of stories told beside the brazier, memories of earlier festivals and long-ago illnesses that helped the next generation understand the fragility they too would one day face. The household gods received the same steady attention, now tended sometimes by grandchildren, who had learned the names by watching their grandparents perform the familiar motions, and the small offerings gained an added layer of meaning as parents contemplated their own place in the chain that stretched forward and back. Even in advanced age, when breath grew shorter and steps slower, the family's daily life absorbed these changes without fanfare, the elderly contributing what they could through mending or watching over the youngest, while the stronger members handled heavier tasks. Illness in later years brought the same blend of remedies and prayers that had marked childhood crises, yet now the watchers at the bedside were those who had once been watched, their vigilance shaped by gratitude for years of guidance and the quiet recognition that every life eventually returned to the soil beneath the olive trees. When an elder passed, the rituals at the household shrine grew solemn for a time, an extra lamp kept burning, and a portion of food set aside in remembrance, yet the cycle resumed as surely as the festivals returned each year, the family closing ranks around the living and trusting that the Lares would continue their watch over whatever new configuration emerged. In this way, the festivals, the coming-of-age rites, the marriages, and the care of aging parents all wove together into a single fabric, each thread strengthening the others, so that ordinary Roman parents could face the uncertainties of their world with the steady knowledge that their efforts, however small, belonged to something enduring. If you have followed this path through the narrow streets and the crowded insula, through the first cries of infants and the measured steps of apprentices, through feasts and fevers alike, you may begin to sense that the distance of 2,000 years is not as vast as it first appears. Roman parents rose each morning with the same quick tally of tasks that parents still perform today. Who needs feeding? Who needs watching? Whose cough has lingered too long? The names of the gods have changed, the coins in the purse have altered their faces, yet the pulse of care remains unaltered, a steady beat beneath every empire's noise. That pulse carried love without measure and worry without end. A mother in the Subura might press an extra crust into a child's hand before sending him to the market, just as parents now slip a note into a lunchbox or check a phone's location one last time. A father might linger at the doorway after his son had gone to his apprenticeship, listening for the sound of steady footsteps, the same way modern parents watch from windows until taillights disappear down the road. Hope threaded through both eras as well, the quiet conviction that today's small sacrifices might open a wider path tomorrow, whether that path led to a modest shop on the Quirinal or to a university lecture hall half a world away. These feelings did not require marble forums or imperial decrees to exist. They lived in the tilt of a lamp over a sleeping child, in the careful saving of a few sesterces for a better cloak, in the whispered prayer offered to whatever power might be listening. The same tenderness that once coaxed a fever down with cool cloths and murmured charms now guides thermometers and bedtime stories. The anxiety that once watched for signs of plague or failed harvest now tracks report cards and late-night messages. Across the centuries, the language of parental love has stayed remarkably constant, spoken in gestures more than in words. As the last lamps gutter in the tenement windows and the city settles into its uneasy rest, the Tiber reflects a scatter of stars and the distant glow of watchfires along the walls. Olive groves beyond the gates hold the day's warmth a little longer, their leaves stirring with the same breeze that once carried the scent of bread and wood smoke through Rome's alleys. In the quiet that follows, the household gods keep their silent vigil, not because the old rites demand it, but because someone still remembers to leave a crumb or a drop of oil, an act of continuity that needs no audience. Thank you for walking this ordinary Roman day with me, for staying through the births and the losses, the festivals and the farewells. If the journey has stirred your curiosity or given you a moment of calm, a like helps others find these stories, and a comment telling me where you're listening from would mean a great deal. I read each one. If the channel's quiet, histories resonate with you, subscribing and sharing your support keeps the lamplight burning for the next chapter. Until then, may your own household gods, whatever form they take, watch over you as gently as they watched over Rome.